Walt Cole, and I'm at the Upper Edelman School. I'm standing in this area because originally the road cut down through here, and the road was changed. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the outside of the school, and then we're going to go inside where it's quieter. And when we're inside, I'm going to talk about the other Plainfield elementary schools, and then I'm going to talk about the Edelman School. I'll talk about the history of the school. I'll show you the different memorabilia of the school. I'll talk about interesting stories in the school, and I'll talk about the future of the school. So this is the school, and as you look at it, well, first of all, on the far left was the boys' outhouse, and on the far right behind it was the girls' outhouse. And as you look at it here, you had a bell. The bell was not original, that was added. The original windows are no longer there. They were rotted, so they've been replaced. That is the original door. And on the left cement, right in front of the door, was a metal where the children would scrape off the mud from their shoes before they entered the school. Later on, there was a well dug on the right side in the back. That well was not there when it was a school. While the windows are not original, the door is original. And if you take a close look at the entrance, you can see how it's sort of worn down, the cement entrance. The original school also had shutters. In the 1990s, Don Leiser bought the school with the intention of preserving it as a school. And to the right of the school, he built this building, which he called Don's Toy Box. And he had all kinds of artifacts and things that he had collected, old tractors. He actually has a 1948 fire truck from Academy fire truck in here. So this is where he put a lot of his, he called it Don's Toy Box. So this is a Slate Belt Heritage Center map of the Slate Belt, and it was made several years ago by David and Mark Blau. What we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on Plainfield Township. And as we zoom in on Plainfield Township, hopefully you can see different colors: green, red, a few red, and a few black. So Sullivan Trail had 3 schoolhouses. The first one, the most southern one, was, and these were in 1860. They were probably earlier in 1860. In fact, some of these schools probably go back to the colonial period, but they were definitely located on an 1860 county map, which we had an opportunity to look at. So this one is in North Stuckertown, probably between Sawmill and the top of the hill there. Then moving up towards Belfast, through Belfast, north of Belfast, and Sportsman Club Road, across from what used to be Hartman's 2, was also a schoolhouse. And then the third one was probably a third of the way between Belfast and Wind Gap, and that was on Getz Road. Now, at that time, Wind Gap and Penarge were part of Plainfield Township, but I'm not really going to talk about those schools. Now, when we get back to 191, you had a school at Edelman, one school. You'll notice below, this is the school we're at right now. Now, below that school was a later school. It was not on the 1874 map. And now I have that in black. So there would be 2 schools an upper Edelman, and a lower Edelman. This school was originally called Woodring School, this school that we're at right now. Now, when you continue north on 191, you get to Penardrel Road. On this side would be Bono Pizza, and there was a school on the 1816 map called Bitts School. Then, a little bit further on the Penardrel Road, you got to the Crossroads School, which is where, just east of Waste Management, Delabole and Penardrel Road. And then when you go down into Delabole, you had another school, much earlier school. Now, the Crossroads School was a much later school. The Delabole School was much earlier. There was also a later school just south of 512. If you would turn at Lessig Oil, go down along a parallel road, and eventually return to 512. About halfway along that road, there was a school, but that was a more recent school. And then finally, there was a school which was not on the 1860 map, and that was the Kesslerville School. Now, I should mention that when you get to the Crossroads School, east of Waste Management, if you go about a mile to Heimer Road, there was a school called the Forest School, and that was also on the 1860 map, and that's in green. And then you go about another mile, less than a mile, and you get to Church School, which is at St. John's Lutheran Church. Around the curve on Church Road, past Abel Colony Road, I had this in red because that school was not there in 1860, but it was on the 1874 map. This is a road that goes from St. Peter's Lutheran Church to Wingate Middle School, and it's on Church Road. So this is a Delabole School, one of the oldest schools in Plainfield Township. Delabole was settled around 1741, so I would imagine this was sometime during the 1750s or 60s, maybe 70s, when this school was started. This particular building was built in 1910, and it was a school from 1910 to possibly 1930. This building was also the site of the Delabole Union Sunday School, and there were church services in the Delabole Union Sunday School until 1965. So 1 mile west of downtown, the center of Delabole, on the Penardrel Road and the Delabole Road, just east of Waste Management, is Crossroads School. Now, this was a newer school. Originally, it was offices for a company. And when the company left, it became a 2-room school. 1st through 4th grade would be on the left side. 5th through 8th grade would be on the right side. Perhaps when this school opened up, it might have been the reason why the Delabole School was closed around 1930. So on Heimer Road and Delabole Road, about a mile from the Crossroads School, was the Forest School. By the way, it's spelled F-O-R-I-S-T, the Forest School. So St. John's Lutheran Church is about a mile, less than a mile, from the Forest School. This was the first school in the township. One source says it was built in 1750, another source 1760. Since Plainfield Township was settled after the Walking Purchase and settlers arrived in around 1741, I would think that the 1750 might be the more accurate date. Originally, it was a log cabin and a log church. 2 buildings. This is the building that you see next to the left of the home. This was a parochial school. In fact, most of the schools during this period were parochial schools. Teachers were chosen by the church and paid by the church. In this particular school, the teacher had additional duties. He was the church sexton. He was also the caretaker of the cemetery, and he or she was also the secretary to the pastor. Many additional duties in addition to teaching. This school remained a parochial school until 1834, when the State Free School Act was paid and this parochial school became a public school. About a half a mile on Church Road from St. John's Church to the Wingate Middle School, past Abel Colony Road, was another schoolhouse, and I'm not sure, you can see it's been made into a very, very extensive home, but I'm not sure what the name of this school was. So this is a school north of Belfast, across from where Hartman's 2 was on Sportsman Club Road and Sullivan Trail. It was a 2-room school. Actually, in Plainfield Township, there were 4 2-room schoolhouses, and the rest were 1-room schoolhouses. This is the Kesslerville School. It's about a mile on Kesslerville Road from Achenbach's Grove. It's been restored, and I know in the past they did have open houses at this school. So just south of 512, between Lessig Oil and Penn Jersey Gas, was the Blue Mountain School. This was also a 2-room schoolhouse. This school was a little bit different in that this was attended by Slaters rather than the Plainfield schools, which were mostly attended by farmers. Now, there were 3 other schools mentioned on the early maps, which I do not know where they were. One was called the Schmidt School. One was called the Delp School, which was a 2-room school. And one was called Teal School. Eventually, Plainfield Township had 14 elementary schools, which were used until Plainfield Elementary School was built in 1952. So, any senior citizen, mid-70s or older, that grew up in Plainfield Township probably attended one of these 14 schools. I'm going to talk about the history of the Edelman School, the Upper Edelman School. It was built in 1856. It was originally called the Woodring School. In 1852, when Plainfield Elementary School opened up, the school was sold to a Dr. Flory, who had a nearby farm. He took the outhouse down to the nearby farm, which was used for the migrant workers. He would come up here to relax, to have a quiet time, perhaps read, perhaps just meditate. In the 1970s, he sold it to Helen Young. I mentioned that Helen Young was a retired teacher from Tamaqua who always wanted to own a school. So she bought the school. It was completely empty, and they restored it. She had it open for the bicentennial in 1976. She lived in New Jersey, and she would come over and spend the day while I had my 9th graders come down. Spend maybe 20 minutes per class. I could have them look at the school, hear about the school, and return during the class period. One year, the 2nd graders from Plainfield Elementary School spent all day in this schoolhouse doing school activities. In the early 1990s, it was sold to Don Leiser. He continued to open for school tours. When Don passed away, his daughters continued to maintain the school, continuing his legacy. In 2015, Penargil students Kaylee Moore and Sarah Riegel cleaned the school painted the door, had an open house, printed a brochure, and this was part of their Girl Scout Silver Award project. So when Helen Young bought the school, she and her husband, the building was empty. And she was a retired elementary teacher from Tamaqua. And she had always wanted to own a one-room schoolhouse. So in the early 70s, she bought the school. And then as a hobby, she and her husband went to auction sales and so on and purchased all of these objects that you see in the school. Nothing is original. Nothing is original. So fortunately her husband was a handyman, and they got a pot-belly stove, they got the chimney clean, and it did work. They got slate board, that was gone. They installed that, and they installed the wooden border at the bottom for the erasers. They purchased the desk from a one-room schoolhouse in Tamaqua. They put in all these bookshelves, filled it with books, and completely refurnished the store, keeping in mind that nothing is original. Okay. Some of the objects that the Youngs purchased to put in the school, the type of pen, we had an inkwell. In fact, even when I was a student at Lincoln School in Bangor, we didn't have a ballpoint pen or anything. So you had that. This was a book rack. I guess it would be like the modern day backpack, where you could loosen it, and fasten your books and carry it. There was a whole set of, you would put ink on them and you would make up your own worksheets. This particular one was easy division, but you would have all kinds of mathematical blocks that you could make up your worksheets. And as students came, Penargil students, Bangor students, the Youngs opened the school up, they might either leave little messages, or many times they would leave drawings and comments about their visit to the school. One other interesting thing that the Youngs came across was an old school lunchbox. It was a folding collapsible one that you would put together like this, and you would take your lunch to school in the lunch box. I don't think they ate as much as we ate, but that was, they also used large boxes, lard cans and that, to bring their schools together, lunches to school. So there were many notebooks in the school. People would sign it, visitors would sign it when the school was open, and they would make comments. They might say, I attended the school, or my relatives attended the school. They might say, it brings back memories. Another comment might be, thanks for keeping it alive. I brought students down here when I taught 9th grade, all the students. Mrs. Young would come down here, and later on, Don Lizer. And they would sign in comments such as, it's amazing, it's great. One comment might be, it's so small. Now, of all the different objects that are from this school, this is an 1874 ledger that the school had to have for the county. Inside, you would have a list of the boys, their age, their attendance,
List of the girls, age, and attendance. You would have subjects taught. And again, this is 1874. It was basically your 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, once in a while a little geography, once in a while history, U.S. history, but no science, no art, music, health, anything like that. On this side, they would have a listing of all the books that they were using. And then on the bottom, they would have a list of visitors that attended the school. This was a very interesting book in that there were a lot of surprising things. I was surprised at the number of visitors. I was surprised at the number of men visitors. In the month of January 1880, there were 11 visitors during that month. They were all men. Now, possibly they could have come in January because they were mostly farmers. On one particular day, there were 8 visitors in one day. Why? Who knows? And the school must have been very crowded. They might stay for 15 minutes. They might stay for an hour. Once in a while, school directors would attend the school. They would stay a half an hour, perhaps. Once a year, the county superintendent, whose name was Joseph Werner, attended the school. Now, Joseph Werner actually lived in Penargil. He lived on the corner of Applegate and Robinson Avenue. It was the first home built above 512. When it was built in the 1880s, they thought the guy was crazy to live so high in the mountain. So Joseph Werner was the superintendent of Northampton County Schools. Something that surprised me was the number of students. Again, this is a small school. I should point out that the bookshelves weren't here, so the room would be a little bit larger. This ledger is from 1878 to 1883. And during those years, the students ranged from 40 students to 48 students. Can't imagine having 40 to 48 students in this school. Perhaps because of this reason, so many students, perhaps that's why the lower Edelman school was built. It was not surprising that there were more younger students than older students. In 1879, there were 40 students. There were 4 13-year-old boys, 1 13-year-old girl, 1 14-year-old girl. So out of the 40 students, 6 were either 13 or 14. Once in a while, you had some unusual student. There was one year there was a 5-year-old boy, one year a 5-year-old girl. In 1878, there was a 15-year-old boy and a 17-year-old boy. So it's sort of interesting imagining a 6-year-old boy, say, with a 13-year-old boy. When I interviewed Lefty Lessig, I said, did it ever create any problems? Were you intimidated being a 6-year-old boy in a school with 13-year-old boys? He said, no. He said, it worked out fine. Well, that was back then. I don't think it would be workable today. Something else that surprised me was I assumed that these boys and girls would go to school until they're 13. But there was no mandatory school law at that time. In 1878, there were 5 6-year-old boys. The next year, only 2 of them returned. Those 2 did continue in school until they were 13. The girls seemed to have better attendance. That same year, 1878, there were 4 girls, 6-year-old girls. 3 of the 4 would continue until they were 13. Keep in mind that a lot of children didn't go past 13. Most didn't. I interviewed a man whose father had 9 siblings. Not one of them, now this was during the Depression, not one of them attended school past the age of 13. Now, another thing that I noticed was, and you can notice it a little bit here, the number of boys, the number of girls. For example, in 1883, there were 29 boys, only 17 girls. Why? Well, perhaps they didn't feel that the girls needed much of an education. They're probably destined to be mothers, housewives, and as a result, they didn't need much of an education. One final comment. You had large families. I already mentioned the two that had like 9 siblings in that. So it was common to have brothers, sisters, cousins in the same class. For example, in 1883, Edelman's, of course this is Edelman School, there were 4 Edelman boys, 5 Edelman girls, probably related. There were 9 Edelmans. That same year, there were also 6 Fainals. Now, you have to also remember that the Edelman girls grew up, had children, so some of their children would have been students in this school too. So who knows how many were all related from the Edelmans or from the Fainals. Imagine you going to a school as a 6-year-old with 13-year-old, or imagine you going to school with many of your siblings, brothers, sisters, cousins, and so on. If you have a chance to visit this school, you might like to look at this 1874 ledger and see if you have any ancestors that were members of this school. I mentioned that people would write comments about their experiences here or their memories at the school. One very interesting comment was written by Stanley Kessler. Stanley Kessler was a teacher here from 1940 to 1942. He went off to war. After the war, he returned here as a teacher. He became a principal of Evangelical school district, elementary schools, and he eventually became Wilson High School superintendent. He left about 3 pages of his memories of the school. He talked about the potbelly stove and how they would heat it with wood or coal. He mentioned that he would sometimes come on a Sunday afternoon to warm up the school during the winter so it wouldn't be too cold for the students. He said the students carried their lunches. There was no well, no water, so he would send 2 boys to Dr. Flory's farm to get a bucket of water. Each student would have a collapsible cup. He mentioned how it was dark and cloudy days and rainy days. He also wrote that when you're a teacher in a one-room school, you're a one-man team. You're on your own. The students did enjoy clapping erasers, washing the blackboard. I remember doing that as a student at Lincoln School in Bangor. Students would stay after school to help sweep the floor. I don't think I would have enjoyed that. If a student was sick, he would put one of the older responsible students in charge and he would take the student home. Can you imagine doing that today? There were 2 recesses, 10:15 to 10:30, 2:15 to 2:30, and they had a 1-hour lunch. It's an awful long time for lunch. He wrote that the reason for school was to educate and to build character. That really hasn't changed. He also wrote that I attended a one-room schoolhouse, and I think that gave me an advantage. A good teacher had to be able to know how to organize groups, how to organize groups according to their ability. Perhaps a student will skip a grade. You would use students to help other students. When I taught a math concept, I would have the better students go with the other students to conduct the drills. We emphasized math, reading, Once a week we had music, art, and health. Teachers had the respect of students and parents. When he started teaching, the school year was 160 days. He got paid $800 for the year. When they increased it to 180 days, his salary increased to $1,000 a year. $1,000 a year. When he went in the Army, he was making $500 a month. So in the Army, he was making $6,000. When he was teaching, he was making either $800 or $1,000. Another person wrote comments. Once a year, the superintendent would visit the school, mostly talking to the teacher. The teacher would call groups and subjects to the front of the room, and the teacher sat and taught the class. Sometimes we studied outdoors. 2 boys would go to a nearby farm, it was about 1/8 of a mile away, to get a bucket of water. When they returned, they were lucky if they had a half a bucket of water left. Students were not allowed to go to the outhouse during a test. Once, the student in front of me peed. The teacher wouldn't let him go, or go. The student peed. The student was allowed to go home. I had to remain in school all day with wet shoes. There was another memory. 1952, Dr. Flory sponsored an immigrant family from Europe. This family was going to work on his farm. But the family originally lived in this schoolhouse until a farm was available. And the girl said, I was a little girl, and that was my family. Lefty Lessig attended the school on Church Road around the corner from St. John's Church. He said his teacher was Stanley Kessler, the one in the picture. He lived in Kesslerville, but when it was going to be a bad snowstorm or something, he would stay at a nearby farm. School was never canceled. We would walk sometimes when the school was as high as the fence. Once in a while, a farmer would pick us up to take us to school. Lefty Leslie said one of the traditions back in those days was to have lockout day. And if there was lockout day, you didn't have school. So the one day, right before school started, they knocked a bee's nest from a tree outside the school. The bees went into school, so they had their lockout day. Another gentleman told me that when he went to the forest school, they snuck into school early. They nailed the windows down. They nailed the door closed. The teacher came, couldn't get in. The teacher went home. Bruce May had an interesting childhood. He went to a one-room schoolhouse, and then for a year or so, he moved to a large school in western Pennsylvania. But then, after a short time, he returned to the 2-room school, the Blue Mountain School, right below 512. He said they had a coal stove, and students would carry coal from the coal yard. 1st through 4th grade was in one room. 5th through 8th grade was in the second room. You had 2 teachers. When the 5th and 6th graders were studying, the teacher would be teaching the 7th and 8th graders. Of course, he said we didn't study much. We generally listened to what the 7th and 8th graders were being taught. When it snowed, the teacher lived pretty far away. So the students would come to school. If the teacher didn't arrive, they would just return home. And he also mentioned that most of his classmates were slavers. Another person mentioned that once a year, they would go to the Crossroads School for a physical in the basement. A sheet was set up. Girls were on one side, boys were on the other side. They would be partially undressed. The girls would complain that the boys would stand on the chair and peek over the sheet. This is a school picture from 1937. That would be during the Depression. And that was at the school around the corner on Church Road, around the corner from St. John's Lutheran Church. You'll notice that there were 18 boys. There were 10 girls. Notice their clothing. Notice how some of the boys had overalls on, but they might have a tie under the overalls. Many of them had white shirts on. The teacher is in the back, and his name is Stanley Kessler. The first row, the second boy from the left is Claude Lessig, and the fourth boy from the left is Sherwood, or Lefty Lessig. This was his picture. The tall boy in the back next to Mr. Kessler was Warren Italy, who started Daisy Bar. So this is a 1937 school picture of Lefty Lessig and his classmates. I mentioned that Don Leiser purchased the school in the 1990s, and his family continued to honor Don and his legacy. Eventually, the Pleasing Valley Charitable Foundation was established. It was called Pleasing Valley because that was the name of the Leiser farm, which is perhaps a mile north of 191. The public can join the Pleasing Valley Charitable Foundation for $1. There are 4 board members. Rob Giuliani, who is the grandson, is the president, and 3 former employees of Leiser Rental are the board members. They maintain the school, paint it, mow the lawn, replace the windows. They hope to have a few open houses. If you would like to contact them, they can open the school for groups. And the website is pleasingvalleyfoundation@gmail.com. pleasingvalleyfoundation@gmail.com. In conclusion, I would like to thank many people that I talked to. I would like to thank Rob Giuliani, and the Pleasing Valley Charitable School for continuing to preserve this school. I would like to thank the Slate Belt Heritage Center for all their work in preserving and the rich history of the Slate Belt. And I would like to thank Dan Trinati for reporting and editing this program. And I would like to thank you for viewing this program. Have a good day.